Truth. What is truth? This cynical question of Pilate's has a very contemporary ring, doesn't it? Especially as we approach an election time. But in many aspects, we've heard how we live in a world of fake news. And wartime, such as is tragically being witnessed at the moment, well, the first casualty of war is, of course, the truth. It's been very sobering for me to read recently of the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine and why they are, because of the ideology on which this has been based. I've read of the concept of a transnational Russian sphere or civilization called Holy Russia. It's a concept of Russia as being, including the Ukraine and Belarus, as well as Russia itself, as well as all ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people throughout the world. They compose Holy Russia in this ideological view. Moscow is seen as the political centre. Kiev in the Ukraine is seen as its spiritual heart, the mother of all Rus, as it's abbreviated. Therefore, Russia sees Ukraine as necessarily Russian because, and its independence as a threat to the unity and integrity of this concept of Holy Russia, which derives its identity from the unity of the Russian Orthodox Church, of which Ukraine is seen to be the spiritual heart, but currently is independent of. Now, this sounds fanciful to our thinking. We think, what? And certainly there'll be all sorts of economic and other reasons and rationalisations. But this is a big part of the rationalisation of what is taking place. It is, of course, based on a lie. The lie is that God or the teaching of Jesus in any way endorses a concept of Christianity tied to ethnicity or a nationalistic agenda. As we know from our creeds, we believe in the Holy Catholic Church. The word Catholic means universal for all nations, neither Jew nor Greek, neither Scythian or barbarian, as Paul says in his thing. The uniqueness of Christian faith is it's not the faith that belongs to a particular nationality, as we might see Islam as Arabic, for example, or Hinduism as Indian. And when you get this sort of nationalism tied in around religion, it becomes quite demonic because it's based on a lie and it excludes people on the basis of their nationality rather than God offering himself to all. A declaration from the worldwide leaders of the Eastern Orthodox Church in all its many nationalities and varieties has 1,330 signatories stating that clearly the Russian Orthodox Church is in error, quoting extensively from the scriptures why they are so deceived, sadly and tragically. So it is based on a lie, and the whole invasion is likewise. And yet surveys show 80% of Russians endorse this war. I found that hard to believe. You will have heard the quote, "People will believe a big lie sooner than a little one. And if you repeat it frequently enough, people will sooner or later believe it." And that's a quote from a United States government report looking at Hitler and his strategy and philosophy for how he went about mass manipulation of the German people. So is it any surprise that the one who described his purpose as being sent by God to bear witness to the truth, that is Jesus, of course, "I came to bear witness to the truth, and all who seek the truth follow me." This explains why Jesus was so forcefully rejected by the leadership of his day. They, the Jewish religious establishment, the Sadducees, Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, the aristocratic leaders and ones who ran the temple and had power because the temple was the central part of their religious observance, They had made an idol of the Jewish nation, which, yes, was God's chosen people, but it was chosen for a purpose, to be a blessing to the world, not to sit there and think, aren't we better than everyone else? And the symbolic centre of the Jewish faith, the temple, was never meant to be an idol, to be protected, as it was, because Caiaphas the high priest defended the murder of Jesus on the basis that they had to preserve the temple, feeling that with Jesus' popularity, the Roman occupying army would get upset and come in and get rid of the temple. Well, they did, but it wasn't because of Jesus' popularity. It was the judgment of God, as Jesus prophesied in 70 AD. Jesus constantly challenged the religious leaders. He exposed their lies and their hidden motives. Remember when they tried to trap him, asking him, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? Well, that was a no-win question. If he said, yes, you should, well, then the people would have left him, thought he's not one of us. If he said, no, you shouldn't, well, then they'd just dob him into the Romans and he'd get killed by them. But Jesus answered by saying, why are you trying to trap me? So Jesus constantly was in their face, confronting them and exposing their hypocrisy. And Jesus insisted, when they challenged, why should we believe you? He said, a person who seeks God's honour rather than his own, that person is a man of truth. But he accused them of seeking their own honour and seeking the popularity of the people. Jesus went on to describe Satan as the father of all lies, whose native language is lying. And in fact, he told the religious leaders, in the way that they were behaving, they showed that their father was actually Satan and not the God they claimed to follow. Jesus said those who follow his teaching, who put it into practice, are truly his disciples, and they will know the truth, and the truth will set them free. And people who further questioned, why should we listen to you? He said, if you don't believe what I say, at least believe for the sake of the miracles that you've seen me do. They bear witness to who I am, as to the very scriptures that you claim to believe. And foremost amongst these scriptures is the one that Tom read out for us this morning, from Isaiah 53, 52 and 53, written by Isaiah, a prophet, 700 years before Christ. Now, when that was being read, and thanks to the pictures as well, it would have just seemed obvious, well, this is describing what happened to Jesus. But it was written 700 years before Christ. Isaiah, inspired by God, wrote these prophetic words, and many other prophecies were written, predicting how people would look upon the one they'd pierced. And Psalm 22 speaks of the soldiers gambling for his clothing and people mocking him. The parallels in this passage, which I want to focus on for a moment, are astounding and striking for what Jesus endured. The prophet said, this servant of the Lord will be disfigured beyond human likeness, despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, familiar with pain. So consider the scourging that Jesus received by the Romans, as Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of Christ, so graphically sought to portray. How his back was ripped apart, his sides with the bone and the metal fragments tied into the end of the 9 thongs of the whip, the cat of 9 tails as it came to be known. And the crown of thorns thrust into his scalp, and the bruising and lacerations in his face from the fists and the beating of the soldiers, let alone being nailed to the cross. Totally naked was the way the Romans did it, to humiliate to the utter degree and bring shame and signify the rejection, the criminality of the people so executed. And then the description of his trial that comes out in the next series of verses from Isaiah, how he was oppressed and afflicted, but he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its slaughters is silent, so he did not open his mouth. And Jesus remained silent before Pilate. He had to be provoked into giving an answer. Pilate was remarked on this and challenged him. Don't you realise I've got authority to save you or kill you? By oppression, it says, a prejudiced trial. They had already decided the result way before they arrested Jesus. They were plotting his murder from quite early in the Gospels, as you read through in context the story. Illegally rushed through at night. The Sanhedrin it was against the law to hold a night trial. Also, they had to have 2 or 3 witnesses, but the witnesses couldn't agree. So in the end, in desperation, the high priest, ensuring that they got a condemnation, put Jesus under oath and said, "Look, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" And Jesus, the man of truth, who could have ducked and weaved to save himself, said, "Yes, I am." And so the high priest tore his robes and said, "Blasphemy!" And he was condemned. So they took him to Pilate because they didn't have the authority under Roman occupation to execute somebody. And then further on, he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Remember how he was hung between 2 thieves, and his body laid in the tomb of a wealthy man, Joseph of Arimathea. The very things alluded to in Isaiah's prophecy, the detail of that prophecy. I encourage you to read Isaiah, the end of 52 and 53. Reflect on it deeply. And the interpretation of his death, not just the detail, revealing God's purpose through Jesus. As Jesus himself had said, to give his life as a ransom for many. A ransom. That is, to purchase from captivity those who had no other way out. The good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. As it goes on to say, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted, for his own sins, in other words. But he was pierced for our transgressions, our breaking of the laws of God, the commandments. He was crushed for our iniquities, the perversion in our lives, the punishment that brought us peace, forgiveness, freedom from guilt, from the fear of God's judgment, through God's forgiveness. That punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. There's this transfer that's taken place. The story is told of a fierce fire that burned through the Yellowstone National Park in America, following which the park ranger went to look at the destruction and just see what damage had been done. And he noticed at the foot of a tree this blackened, charred bird with its wings spread. And he just casually turned it over with his foot. And lo and behold, out from underneath those wings ran several chicks, young baby chicks, healthy and alive. And he realised that that mother bird could have saved itself by flying beyond the flames of the fire, but had chosen to stay and protect its chicks and save their life for the future because they couldn't yet fly. And that's a graphic picture of what Jesus has done for us. In fact, Jesus describes himself in one part as a mother hen. He said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you kill the prophets and stone the messages God sent to you. If only you had listened to me. I'm like a hen, a mother hen. If only you would have gathered under my wings." We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. Yet, instead of sending lightning bolts to wipe us out, as I deserve at least, you're a good bunch, I'm sure. It says, the Lord has laid on Jesus the iniquity of us all. No wonder he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? No wonder the sky went black for 3 hours as Jesus hung on the cross. as the sin of the world, past, present and future, in some way was absorbed into the sinless Son of God's body and spirit on that cross. Jesus stood alone as one who even Pilate said is without fault. Yet there was a higher purpose, as I've just alluded to, in the counsels and the mercy of God to Jesus' death. It wasn't just a sad failure and a tragic end to a hopeful mission. This was what the people of Israel had anticipated through all of their history, and it had been spoken by the prophets, that God himself would visit his people and would wipe away their sins. That's the message of the Old Testament through the prophets. And here in Jesus, God came in the flesh, in the person of the pure Son of God, the Messiah Jesus, and suffered punishment and abandonment and the desolation that sin brings, to bring forgiveness to all who dare to believe, who dare to admit the truth about ourselves before God. Jesus came to heal lives and communities and nations, to end wars, to transform us through changed hearts and minds and thinking, putting aside lying ideologies and leading people into the truth of what God has revealed. He wants to transform us, our hearts and minds, and lead to behaviours that flow from such change. I've just finished reading the story of an incredibly changed life of a man, an English person, Paul Cowley. It's called Thief, Prisoner, Soldier, Priest. An unlikely combination. An amazing story. Paul Cowley grew up with an alcoholic father who, at the age of Paul's 16, he was trying to defend his mother with yet another argument in the house. See, whenever you try and speak truth, you get competition. So be ready for the kickback when you speak. Paul was kicked out of home at the age of 16. He went onto the streets, got in with the wrong crowd, became a repetitive thief, got jailed for it. He wasn't a very good thief, he says. He kept getting caught. After that, he ended up getting into the army, and they made a man of him. And yet he became focused on his ambition of getting further and further promotion. And in the meantime, he went through 2 marriages and 2 divorces. It wasn't working for him in terms of life. After 17 years in the army and 2 divorces, as I said, he encountered Jesus. And he went to an Alpha course, such as the one we'll be running next term, both daytime and evening. And you're invited to ask me more about that. Through this, he came to know Jesus and know Jesus. But as he grew in his faith, as he began to be part of a Christian community, and as he began to read God's word and to discover God's purpose for his life, he realised there's more. And even for one as him, he thought, well, I'm lost. God can't use a sinner like me. But he discovered that God takes a specialty in taking people who dismiss themselves and the world might dismiss as the lowest, as we heard in our reading that Tom brought, the other reading. And God delights in taking nothing and turning it into something. And so Paul became part of the team that were visiting prisons and taking the Alpha film series into prisons to bring hope to prisoners. And eventually he became the leader of this whole organisation throughout the UK, and he actually developed it wider with global networks because of his army contacts and because of some Christian people in high-ranking positions. He was able to get Alpha into the forces, the army, the air force and the navy. And he oversaw this globally. He'd done so many courses in the army, he'd trained in so many ways. He established a network to integrate ex-prison offenders. There was a real problem of recidivism. And so a network to integrate ex-offenders into local church communities and into the wider community. And he became a strong and respected advocate for reform of the prison system in UK and in different nations to which he's been invited to speak. Now, this has taken 25 years. He's been in this role for 25 years. And he is quite frank that if he had not met Jesus, he would have continued in his ambitious army career, looking after himself and sabotaging his closest relationships, one after another after another. None of what has transpired would have happened. And his story can be multiplied millions of times over human history of the change Jesus has brought into people's lives and communities and nations through changed lives, where wounded people have allowed Jesus to heal their hearts and their hurts and their minds, and in many cases their bodies as well. So as we remember today, this Good Friday, with deeply grateful hearts, what Jesus has suffered for us, what he has saved us from, that is our own sins and the hurt and the brokenness of relationships that takes place, to heal us in our hearts and minds and spirit, so that we become part of the answer instead of part of the problem. God's specialty is turning sinners into saints, so to speak. Not that we're ever perfect, far from it. God continues to be a God who forgives us and loves us and changes us into the likeness of Jesus, bit by bit. His aim is to bring healing to the nations, but we must be willing to accept the truth about ourselves as complicit in the sin and darkness of this world that we look at and we despair of at times. The truth in Jesus, who described himself as the way, the truth and the life, the very Son of God, who alone can bring change to this broken world and our lives, change so desperately needed. It is through such lovers of the truth, lovers of Jesus, that God chooses in his mercy and grace to bring change and healing. Will you be part of this wonderful plan of God's? Will you allow Jesus to do in your life all that is in his heart for you? The very reason he created you, designed you, so that he might touch your heart with his healing love and forgiveness and truth. Let Jesus come into your life, invite him in, and let him shape you from the inside out to become the very person he designed you to be, for your joy, for his glory, and for the healing and blessing of many lives. Shall we pray?